We're talking about fear. We're talking about there's nothing to fear except, well, I'm pretty much afraid to do anything or most Christian stuff. Subtitled by I ain't afraid of no ghosts, except I am afraid of the Holy Ghost. So, so the question that we're going to start off with this week is because we've talked about how do you define fear, give an example of something that you fear, someone that you fear. We've talked about what do you think is the cause, the root of personal fear. We've talked about how do you behave when you feel afraid or frightened. So this next question is one that reads, how do you explain or how do you justify your behavior when you're afraid? How do you explain or how do you justify how you respond when you feel afraid or frightened? Why do you do what you do? And hopefully, if you have some Sunday school framing, you've got something written there. So just go ahead and read what you wrote.
So, Preston,
Yes.
I actually wrote, I don't think I've ever justified it. I just react.
Huh.
I mean, honestly, because
Yep.
spiders are smaller than me. I probably shouldn't be afraid of them, right? As Nathan nods his head. But I mean, I looked at that and I'm like, I don't think I've ever explained it or even justified, rationalized why I'm afraid.
Yep. Yep. So can I ask a question back there, Sarah? So you're
Sure.
saying that you've got a fear, but you really actually post the fearful situation. You haven't tried to break down the reason and the rationale as to why that circumstance makes you behave that way.
I can't, I don't know when my fear first started. It's almost like it's always been there,
Yep.
right? And
Yep.
so I don't really know why. I just, like I said, I just react. Sometimes I overreact, but I just react. You can't see Nathan, but he's over there vigorously nodding his head at me. Yeah. But you know, it's kind of, it's almost like it's, I don't know if it's an ingrained fear or just a stupid one or some kind of combination of them.
Yeah.
Some of
Okay.
the
So
fears we've
yeah,
talked
go ahead.
about, I think we might fall into the category of irrational fear. You know, things that we're afraid of that we may not even understand why, like she said, and because we don't understand why it is, we can't explain it. We can't justify it. We can't make it rational because it is irrational. I mean, and most of the phobias we have um, are like that. So I'm kind of with her. It's like, how do you explain it? No, I can't. The fear that I have is the fear that I have. Um, and partly maybe it's because if we do try to in some way explain it or justify it, there's an end result we're kind of looking towards avoiding. And that may be in the case of um, sharing Jesus with family members. We don't want to get basically a stain on the relationship of some sort, or for folks who work with, we don't want to lose their job. You know, there may be some ultimate result we're trying to avoid, and we that would be the only way I can think of as far as things that might be rational, but irrational. It's kind of like if you have one of those irrational fears, and there are lots of them, it's one of those things where you just kind of say, it's a spider, or it's a precipice, or those things are too heavy to really fly. You know, that kind of thing.
So the second half of your response, Gene, was actually answering the question that this one is. The first part of your answer wasn't. See, and that's the distinction I think that sometimes folks are challenged by when they encounter a question like this. See, because we consider fear sometimes, well, oftentimes irrational, this question is not asking you if the fear is rational or irrational. This question is asking about the behavior that is a part of the fear. So, for instance, let me give you this one, because Sarah, especially after Interlink Fellowship, has been in our household visiting a whole lot without her knowing. And so one of the things we chuckle about right now, because 8888 is pretty hilarious, but Sarah's new entry into this discussion is actually way more hilarious. Her fear of bridges. Now, Sarah's fear of bridges is that she's going to drive off the bridge. Now, we've been watching some TV shows recently, and we've been going, and every time we see this kind of possibility, especially if you're watching kind of super people shows, you will see bridges collapsing. And we immediately go to Sarah and we say, that's the situation that Sarah's talking about right there. So, certainly the fear of bridges makes a kind of sense. But then this question is asking about the behavior that you experience because of the fear. Why does that happen? And here's the thing. When we chuckle about Sarah's driving off of the bridge, we look at that situation and we go, okay, you just have to not drive off the bridge. Don't drive off the bridge. You may feel like you're gonna drive off the bridge, but don't drive off the bridge. And so in that case, with this particular kind of fear, because at least the one dimension that Sarah's giving us is that when I drive over these bridges, especially the ones that kind of are open or they're kind of suspended, I feel like I'm going to drive off of those. So don't feel like you're going to drive off of the bridge. And see, that's a little bit of a different situation than the arachnid kind of thing. But Sarah feels she doesn't like the bridges because she thinks she feels like she's going to drive off the bridge. So the antidote to that would be, don't feel like you're going to drive off the bridge. So let me open that up so you can respond to that.
Preston,
Yeah.
I wrote in this space that the root of most of my fears, and Jimmy kind of brought it home because in our Bible study, it asked you to ask trusted friends a certain amount of questions. And so I did. I asked him, since, he's my best friend and he really will be honest. I know he will be very honest. So, it was, are you humble? And it had other things. And he said, you're humble to a fault. And it was like, you're right. He says, you're a smart woman. You have many skills, but you don't tend to see them. And that's what I wrote. I said, I tend to feel inadequate. And so I don't want to fail or look foolish. So I let those fears control me.
Yeah.
And how do you combat being afraid? Well, I'm jumping ahead, but because I'm looking at this in a whole other light, it's like, gosh, I've never learned to swim because I'm been afraid because of the way my father threw me in the deep end.
Yep.
But I've let these things rule my life and missed out on fun. Won't speak out because I don't feel like I'm going to be wise enough to answer whatever is said. So inadequacy was mine.
Diana, I love that, especially when you gave the description of the swimming. Because, see, we're not talking about is the fear irrational. We're talking about how you behave and that sense of inadequacy. So here's, in that situation, how you would combat that feeling of inadequacy. You pay someone that you trust to give you swim lessons. Or you partner with someone that you trust to give you swim lessons. Because
Amanda's going to do it. We just got to find a pool. I've already talked to her.
Yeah. And you got 2 to 3 daughters who are expert swimmers. So that inadequacy is the feeling that we're talking about. And the question is how do you, that's one of the ways that we behave when we feel afraid. We feel inadequate to the situation. That's partly why Sarah 8888, because somehow, even though she's the son of the friendly giant, somehow the spider seems to say that she's inadequate to take him out if she needs to. Other thoughts about that? The behavior that you experience when you're feeling fear.
Well, I guess, I think I talked about my fear after that car accident years ago, but I'm a very nervous person in a car. So my fear is, no, it's terrible, is, I don't know, I have this fear of not wanting to get hurt seriously in a car. So I am a very cautious driver. I don't like to drive, or I will, if I know it's going to be icy, nope, I'm not going out. Sometimes if we have to go out, I'll sit in the back seat because I feel calmer or safer there. And then I think what Preston gets to experience is when I think he's, pushing the envelope, going through lights, driving through fast, I'm like clutching on to the seats, which is really stupid. But that's my behavior to cope with the fear, because I'm still going to get in a car. I'm not going to stop doing that, but because that would be really stupid. I don't know if that helped at all.
We enjoyed watching Preston's face trying to not react to his wife's responses. That was fun.
But Bruce, I was very calm when you were driving us from Sedona to Phoenix. You did a great job. So no fear there. A lot of
I'm a very
pressure,
good driver.
no fear.
You know what? Let me say this, Mr. I'm a very good driver at 90 miles an hour, and that's all I'm going to say.
I wasn't speeding.
Calmly presented. Thank you very much.
God is my pilot.
Okay. We're talking about fear.
Bruce also drove us on that one-lane dirt road in Maui that was over a cliff, and I was not afraid then either. So.
I'm sorry, over a cliff or beside a cliff?
Beside a cliff.
Okay, thank
That
you.
was the best day ever. We went to this amazing waterfall. It was amazing.
Yeah, any dirt road that goes over a cliff, no thanks. I'm gonna take a pass on that.
I'm with you, Brother Gene, there. That's when I become Sarah in terms of the bridge, because I think it makes sense to drive straight. And if you drive straight going up a mountain, that's going to take you over the mountain. So there certainly is an inadequacy there. And in that regard that my wife described and that Pastor Bruce chimed in on, I'm an excellent driver. The way to combat the inadequacy there is to have somebody else step up.
Phone a friend?
Sure. And let me give you a silly example of phoning a friend. And we'll move on kind of with either your thoughts about this or some answers suggested by the facilitator that may incite your thinking. So unfortunately, I have to tell you that some of the goofier things I've done in my life, I've done with the guy you've met, I think, Ernie. Some of the goofiest things I've done, he and I've done them together. And that sometimes is a fear mitigator. But this one is one that stands out that we have probably told over and over and over again over the past several years. And one was we both like scary stuff. And so we were at his home in Texas, across from the Alamo, where they had a live action scary house, haunted house. Now these are different than the ones that's at King's Dominion. These are the ones that when you go in, number one, you pay. Number two, you sign a waiver that says if you get touched or stuff like that, you will not sue or kill anyone. So, so we decided to do this in part because we're men and we know it's a haunted house. And we're not afraid of no ghosts. Except when we got in there and it was pitch dark. We were screaming like babies, like little girls. So people were touching us and there was scary stuff all over the place. And so the way that we mitigated our behavior, and it didn't mitigate it enough, I mean, at least it got us out, is we held each other's hands and we crawled through the haunted house together. So we were on our knees crawling through the haunted house and screaming and holding hands. And we came out onto the street and Ellen and companion saw us and thought we were the biggest babies there were. Now, there's no way I could have gotten through that haunted house by myself, even though I knew everything in there was artificial. Being in there together allowed me in some ways to deal with the behavior of what my fear could have caused. So that successfully I could get out of there, because there was certainly a point where we thought we were never going to get out. So let me pause there and help you to respond. We're talking about the behavior that you have when you feel fearful.
Can I ask a quick question, Preston?
Yes.
Recently was this?
Yesterday.
No.
Just curious.
15 years ago, maybe. We were a lot younger, tougher, and more vibrant and manly. We were a lot more manly then. So,
But you were still like in your mid-30s, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it takes a minute to hold on.
I was just curious because when you talked about this haunted house, I thought of this one over here because I believe they went into a haunted house once. And didn't you touch somebody?
He touched me.
He actually did punch somebody.
No, in fairness, I was like 10, okay?
So I couldn't help but laugh because I just imagined him punching somebody at 10. But then when you mentioned Ellen, I'm thinking, oh, it's Preston. So I was just curious.
Well, she wasn't going in. But the behavior is when you're afraid. We've got that paralyzation. We've got that flight. None of those really could work in the haunted house because if you're paralyzed, you're never getting out. If you fly, you're going to run into ghosts, and if you fight, you're going to get sued. So the way that we mitigated some of that was by finding each other's hands, making sure that we used our bat radar to scream, and then we crawled to be able to avoid most of the ghosts and other things in there. Yeah, I know. I just lost my man card in some regard, but there's somebody else who shared this trauma with me, so I didn't do it by myself. So there you go. So take a look at the screen here, and this maybe will help to inspire some responses here. How do you explain or justify your behavior when you're afraid? It's an immediate, or it's a pent-up emotional response to staggering, imposing, intimidating circumstances, situations, or persons. Either it's an immediate, or it's something that's aggregated over the years. When you hear Sarah say, I've always been afraid of spiders, well, that's probably not always true, but it feels like that for her. I've always been afraid of public speaking. Well, it's probably not always really that way. There's probably something that did that. Diane said earlier, when I was thrown into the water, that's when it began. Well, that is probably a fairer start than I've always been. And folks, if I'm going to kind of jump out of the secular into the believer world, there are a lot of us who have never done some of the things that Jesus has asked us to do. And thus, because we've always been afraid to do. All right, let me move on to the next question. So how do you combat being afraid? How do you combat the 8888? How do you combat the, got to watch out for the bridge here because I'm going to drive off. How do you combat, I am so afraid to swim, how do you combat, oh my gosh, there's ghosts and goblins in there. How do you combat that?
Okay. So for spiders, I get my husband or kids to take care of it.
Yep.
That's not combating being
Okay.
afraid. That's just using their problem.
Oh, be quiet. That's how I combat them. I hire somebody else, or I get somebody else to do it.
Wait,
Yep.
I'm not hired.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're not paying.
So for bridges, because you can't always avoid them, right?
Right.
Sure you can. You can just go for a swim.
So for bridges, I get as far away from the outer side as possible, going towards the middle,
Yep.
right? That's how I combat that one. And then for heights, the way I combat is I just avoid them.
Yeah, the
Yep.
overall word is avoidance.
Overall word is avoidance. But you can't avoid a bridge, but you can move your position on the bridge to make you feel a little less nervous, a
At
little
risk.
less afraid.
Or
What'd you say, Preston?
At risk.
Yes, at risk. That's a good
hear
word.
me out. You ride on the edge. That way, the fear keeps you the most alert and attentive driver imaginable.
So what Nate is talking about is a therapy that's actually used, and you guys are aware of this. You just don't think about it that way. That's what we call desensitization. But you've got to be able to check and assess a person to see if they're ready for desensitization, because desensitization can sometimes make people go over the edge. Because
Literally.
they're not ready. They're not ready for that encounter at that intense level.
Cowards.
I get, I get it, to combat something, you kind of got to face it head on, but still a little uneasy. So, but there you go. That's how I combat things. I get somebody else to take care of it. I avoid it, whatever.
Yep.
Sarah, what was
Sarah?
the third thing you said that you avoided? I didn't
Say
hear
that one more time.
that you listed three things. The last one you said you avoided, but I didn't hear what that one was.
Heights.
Heights. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not big into heights.
Pairs really well with bridges.
Yeah, I'm not big into heights at all. I've done some things that are high up, and I've done it before, but it's not my most favorite thing to do, so I try to avoid them.
It's a bridge that's built like a cobwebs.
Yep. Who's up next
So-
with a combat technique?
So,
Yes, sir.
just a quick question, Sarah. Does your company have any of those team building events where there's a ropes course?
Yes, and that's one of the things that I did at King's Dominion several years ago, probably like 20 years ago now. And I actually willingly climbed the post. I willingly climbed it, and I willingly tried to jump across to grab the bar. But let me tell you, it was the most frightening thing I had done, even though I was all harnessed up and everything, and I had Frank as my anchor. Steve knows Frank. I had Frank as my anchor. But it was still unnerving. But I did it, but I wouldn't want to do it again.
Yeah, basically the answer to the question is actually twofold. One is going to be avoidance. The other is going to be kind of like avoidance in that it's preparing for it in such a way that you don't end up in the situation. If that makes any sense. So I mean that's the way My fears are very, very few, and the fears that I have are, like I said before, really too personal to share in this group. But apart from the sudden startlements, those happen and you get startled. But um, basically, you do what you can to try to um, preempt, if you will, and it's a kind of an avoidance thing as well. Don't get into the situation where that could happen. I was really kind of surprised. I knew about Sarah's 8 issue, and we were in the rec room in service, and there went one kind of crawling across the floor. I took care of it, and she was all, even after they were squished, she was even still responding. I don't know that I ever understood that, but still, yeah, avoidance or preventative measures is what I would say.
Mine is I'm trying not to avoid it anymore.
Yep.
Trying to approach it more rationally. Now, as far as snakes go, I'm going to phone a friend. I don't worry about not facing that one. I can find somebody who can face that one. But for the things that are holding me back in where areas I want to do something, I need to start rationalizing more of what I'm afraid of, what's the worst case scenario that can happen, and am I still clinging to what someone else said about me? So that's my game plan going forward.
Yeah, I kind of agree with Diane on the snake thing. That's not say it's a true fear, but I don't particularly like them, so it's not something I want to engage with. And I'll ask Jerry to take care of an issue if we have that. Luckily, it's been a long time since we have. And again, trying to push myself to let go of some of the insecurities I've had, whether they're my imagination or things that have affected me in the past from things people have said or done that have kind of stuck with me. Just trying to get over it and move on and not worry about it anymore, which is really difficult. Um, but I, in perspective, and I hadn't thought about this in a long time until we started talking about this being afraid. But I had an experience many years ago that, in relationship to that, I really shouldn't be afraid of much because I know that God can protect me no matter what. Because I was involved in a jewelry store robbery when I was right before, about a year before Garrison was born. And I actually had a gun to my head for a little while and was put in a room with a bunch of other employees and customers who had come in during this robbery. I think they got so tired of people coming in, they quit tying people up. So I wasn't tied up. But they were very afraid, the other people who were already in there, several of them tied up, several of them not. My instinct, and I was, what was weird is I wasn't afraid because in the beginning I thought it was all a joke because I knew the people. I worked 2 doors down and I had gone there for business. And they joked around all the time. So I thought it was just a joke at first. So God protected me in that because he didn't allow that fear reaction in me. But when we were in there and we were told to stay in there, my instinct was to reach out to the people on either side of me in this small little utility room and to pray. They were telling me to shut up, basically, because they were afraid the robbers were going to come back and kill them. So several of the people there needed therapy afterwards for a good while. I went home and refinished a piano. So I know that in the scheme of all of that, that there's nothing that Jesus can't handle for me, whether he would allow that type of reaction to me and that type of protection if I was in a similar circumstance again. I don't know that, but I know he can. I know he did. So in the grand scheme of all that, what have I got to be afraid of? But yet I allow myself to hang on to some of those petty fears that hold me back from doing what he wants me to do. So, really in all that, I know that he is faithful no matter what. So I really don't have any excuses.
And therein is ultimately where this lesson has got to go. And I didn't come from the facilitator. When you have an encounter with the creator of the universe and you have a relationship with him, you shouldn't be afraid of anything. But we are. And Sherry, thank you for that, because I can tell you we're going to revisit that pretty often as we do this together, because we've moved, if you've seen, we've moved kind of from things that frighten us to almost situations that have people fall out. And those are the ones, I appreciate Gene saying, I'm afraid of many things that are just too private to share. I will tell you, most of us are more afraid of stuff that has people fall out, where people are going to feel a certain way that's different about you, or a way that about you that you don't want them to feel. That's where and why typically you don't do some of the things that you do. And Sherry just wonderfully described that, almost separated them, that there's macro fears and micro fears. And the micro fears are sometimes those are the ones that pilot us. Those are the ones that govern us. Because Gina said this before, and I love this because I keep this in my mind as part of my top of mind awareness. You are invincible and invulnerable until Jesus says you're not. So if that's really a guiding light for you, then why don't you? Why don't you take opportunities that potentially you wouldn't? Because if you are invincible and invulnerable until Jesus says it's time for you to come with me, then why don't we?
One thing I don't know if I clarified much is, why don't we call on our friends more? Those fellow believers to walk us through things as well. That was one of my things, is why don't I call on? Is it pride? Is it you don't want to have to follow through? If you ask somebody to help you with something, then there's some follow through expected, right? And then as Sherry said, just knowing the word and knowing God's promises. That was one of the things, in trusting God. So thank you, Sherry, for sharing that. That was pretty powerful.
Yeah, what Sherry just shared right now is almost one of those mic drop situations, because that hedge of protection is never bigger and more evident than in that situation. And Sherry's being able to have calm, not only during it, but then afterwards, that's that peace that surpasseth all understanding. So if we've got that, then why don't we? Because the large stuff, we're okay. We're fine with Jesus has that. But the little anxieties that I have during my day, that's not something to bother Jesus with. And he's probably not really even thinking about that. And that's what permeates my day.
So here's a question that you brought to mind. Do we sometimes, and this is an honest question, do we sometimes think that the little things that we encounter are things that we think he expects us to go ahead and handle? Not that we say, I got this, but that we're thinking that we're supposed to be to a place where we should be able to handle it.
Okay, so I think that answers twofold. And please weigh in, folks. I think that we've got a little Hebrews there, which is, by now, we should all be teachers, right? That's part one of that. And part two is the thing that I learned through Pastor Bruce years ago, Annie Bishop and the Peas, which is this. You got to reorient yourself. Sometimes not every day, not every hour, but sometimes minute by minute to go, Lord, help me not be anxious about this thing. You say that you care for me in the most minute situations. Can you be with me or orient me now?
Okay, so that's a completely different answer than what I was expecting. I appreciate that because that speaks to, and Annie is a great example of that. That speaks to a real every moment, every matter dependence upon the leading of the Holy Spirit and His power. That
You
I'm not there. To be real honest.
you are the air I breathe.
Yeah.
That's why it's not on my song list for us to be singing at this point, because that's where that is, right? That's a reliance that says that yeah, I don't got it. Even when I think I got it, I don't got it. So in my Monday situation with my contractor, as opposed to me praying and saying, Lord, stabilize me and help me to do that which is going to glorify and honor you, I went, let me do what's going to honor and glorify me the best, which is to give this guy a big old Hawaiian punch. So some thoughts about this. How do you combat being afraid? I don't. This is a really good one. And no one really said this, but I've seen this one happen a whole lot. I try to ignore it. And this one happens in more subtle kind of situations. This happens in people's situations. I try to ignore it. That's why we blow off being able to have interactions with folks that we think are too tough for us to cross that bridge with. Try to ignore it. So we know in the back of our head that that person may not know who Jesus is, that that person may not have any inkling about eternity. And what we do is we turn off the button that keeps reminding us, you should, you should, you should. We just turn it off. We ignore it. We try to ignore it. Yes,
that
sir.
seems contradictory to me.
Go
How
ahead.
do you combat being afraid?
Yep.
Try to ignore the fear. That sounds like you're going to move past it. That sounds like you're going to actually act as though you're not.
So there's some interesting concepts here, which is because sometimes the deal with ignoring your fear is you need to recognize that it's there as opposed to pretending to ignore it. So the desensitization happens by recognizing it's a reality and not pretending that it doesn't exist. It's almost like that. Oh, go ahead, Bruce.
That second one speaks to why when I was in my 20s I drank too much.
Huh.
I mean that's why people self-medicate.
Gotcha.
That helps you to ignore what you're afraid of. You know you need to do this, but you don't want to. So if I can self-medicate enough,
I'm numb.
then I ain't got to deal with it today. The old saying is, but tomorrow you wake up and it's still there and you feel worse.
Okay, so that's not really trying to ignore the fear. You're ignoring the issue that causes the fear.
No, you're ignoring the fear too.
Correct.
Look, let's all own this reality. There's a feeling that comes inside you when you're afraid. There's that tenseness, sweaty palms, whatever it may be. And I understand where you're at, Gene. Yeah, certainly. But in the midst, you don't want that feeling. Lots of times we ignore it by just ignoring it, but there's also times where you ignore it by doing something else to override that sense of fear that you have. It's your heart's beating and all that kind of thing. You want that to go away. Sometimes people do that with substances. Actually, I think a lot of people get rid of that. They know they've got to deal with it. They don't like the feeling that they're fearful. So they're going to do something to make it go away.
Hmm.
Lived it, been there, been there
Okay,
for
maybe
years.
maybe the issue is I've not.
Well, that would have a whole lot to do with it, brother. I'm not speaking conceptually. I'm speaking life experience.
Yeah,
Correct.
because see, I've not seen. I mean, and you use self-medicate. I've been sick and I've been self-medicating. But it's been, you know, over-the-counter, legitimate medicines. So that kind of messed me up a little bit. But um, I
She keeps running for the shelter of mother's little helper. That's a great. That's a Rolling
Stones.
Stone song. Mother's
okay.
little helper, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm not talking about going and getting some Aleve, man. That's highly approved. No, I'm talking about something to do a little mood adjustment.
Yeah.
Self-medicate can be food,
Yeah.
relationships, all kinds
Right?
Yep.
of things.
Yep.
Doesn't have to be
Yep.
just booze and alcohol.
Correct.
There's all kinds of things you do to self-medicate.
Correct.
Well said. But yeah, I tended to go a little overboard. So,
Okay. Well, you guys are speaking of life experiences that I've really not had, so I'm going to have to back up and say I don't understand that. Sorry.
well, you probably have though, and you just don't equate it. Because lots of times how people will push that down and ignore it is by doing something else. If I don't like the scary little thought I'm having in my head, I'll go do something else that will distract me, which is the ultimate, comes back to that. You distract yourself from the thing you should be doing. You may flick the TV on. You may go look at your phone. You could, go out in the yard and putter. I think a lot of what we would refer to as being procrastination is fear avoidance. I'm not saying you've done any of those, but that's a lot closer to probably
Okay.
more people's reality.
Well, and so that gets back to the avoidance. Okay.
And sometimes in that ignoring, what you're doing is you're calling that fear or that precipitant something other than what it is, so that it makes it more palatable for you as opposed to dealing with it for what it is. You color it, you shape it differently, you put it in a space where you can kind of ignore it. And I like what Bruce said, procrastination, because sometimes I'm not ready to write the paper. And I don't want to sit down and feel like I have nothing to be able to put down on the page. So I avoid it. But that doesn't mean the fear or the issue is not still there.
So then you fail,
Yes.
and then your fear becomes reality. I mean, a lot of our responses are very self-destructive.
Yes. That's that self-fulfilling prophecy thing. So go ahead, Sherry.
I am the queen of procrastination, so I get that. That's yeah, one of my work in progress things.
I think ignoring it is one that most people practice more than that I don't combat. It's not that they don't combat their fear; they try to ignore it. Crowds, strangers, bills, right? They put themselves in position to ignore stuff. I probably also challenge you that a lot of church people practice ignoring. Any questions there?
That's obvious, even
Right.
amongst ourselves, right?
Yes. I know something is obvious that I need to address, but I'm going to let Bruce do that. Bruce's job. If something I need that needs to get addressed, I'm going to let Gene do that. It's Gene's job. I know I need to face it, but there's other layers in front of me, ahead of me. So as best as I can, I'm just going to pretend it's a non-issue. Um, let me throw out a situation for you to think about this. And again, this isn't a personal fear, but this is one of those situations where there's interaction fear, where it's something that potentially you should get involved in, but you don't. So we're congregating in a building, and we have some folks who are very, very excited about worshiping with us, and they met each other through a dating app, and they're living together, and they are very likely engaged in physical intimacy. So who asked them about that? Nobody. And why we are able to do that effectively is because we ignore it. We ignore that potentially that interaction is going to create someone who's going to want to sever from us, someone who's going to have hurt feelings, is going to put me in an awkward position. And so I'm just going to pretend it doesn't exist, but I'm certainly going to own it's not my responsibility.
Or any of our business.
That
Maybe.
is correct.
But is that because we confront them harshly and throw down ultimatums? I mean, I think that's a lot of churches are doing this. They confront what they can see, where they're not confronting what they can't see. And once you confront in a loving way, it's up to the Holy Spirit to do that work, right? But we tend to want to do that work ourselves.
Yeah, and Diane, I can tell you that that's a great, great, great point. Because, if Bruce hasn't handled this situation, Bruce and I've certainly had this happen from time to time. And it's always a situation where you have to ask, am I handling this in a way that the Holy Spirit would be pleased? Am I following the Holy Spirit's lead? So I can tell you, we had a person that congregated with us for worship who had a Damascus Road kind of experience through his explanation, that he went from being a conspiracy theorist to a Jesus believer. But he became a literal Jesus believer in some aspects of his behavior, and then he also became a little bit excessive in some others. To the point where one of the things that he was convinced he had to do was to sell all of his physical properties and give it away. And in part because I had helped this person to have a relationship with Jesus, I asked him, and I said, where are you getting this from? How is this behavior? How does this honor the Lord? How are you moved to do this? And he showed me the story of the rich young ruler, showed me that particular account. And I said, this isn't for you. I said, this is what this is. This is what this is about. You don't need to conduct yourself in this regard. If there are things that you need to jettison, you need to jettison those, but this doesn't mean you have to sell everything that you have and give it away. Well, ultimately, between that and then some of the other extreme behavior that he was practicing, he got really, really miffed and left. And I think that sometimes that interaction and then its possible fallout is what we work hard to avoid. So we'd rather ignore that outcome than addressing the situation. Because I can tell you, even though that person was a kind of a friend of mine / ours, and the person had professed a belief in Jesus, I was at peace that I didn't need to meddle in his life any further because I said what I think the Lord wanted me to say. And like Sherry said, I could go refinish a piano after that.
I couldn't help but think of Bruce's friend, who's living with a man, and they decided to live separately. You wonder, how long did he go to his church, and did anyone talk to him about that? I don't know if Brucey's ever shared that. Just kind of curious.
Years, church in Norfolk, years. He led the choir. He played the piano in the church. And then went to another church after they disrespected him on some pretty legit things, nothing to do with being gay. But I don't know that anybody ever said, so why are you doing this?
Yeah, I can tell you in a weird, interesting way, since we're just talking about this, in the church, and because it actually is a title, I'll use it. In the black church, previous to the current climate where we are all about pride and embracing this LGBT stuff, that used to be called a situation on the DL, on the down low. Typically, your very vibrant worship leaders, your choir directors were gay. And everybody knew it, but nobody would say anything about it. That's this ignore we're talking about. Because potentially, not only is the outcome going to be that this person is going to be angry towards you and spread whatever sort of venom about you, but you've just lost potentially your choir leader. So it's easier to ignore.
Yeah, but we say this, but we're all sinners. None of that was going to keep us out of heaven as long as we've professed Jesus. That's what I struggle with. If it's you have to be perfect to serve, none of us would serve. And so, yes, their sin is more obvious, but we all have sin. None of it keeps us out of church or out of heaven. Sometimes it does keep us out of church.
Yeah, and Di, you're not wrong about that, but you know what we have to do with folks that are engaging. And let's talk. Whether it's theft or it's murder or it's whatever it might be, right? We have to have folks recognize that their identity is in Jesus and not the identity is in the behavior. And that's where we struggle. So we're perfectly fine with a lot of our churches saying, I'm a gay, I'm a bi, I'm a black Christian. If your identity is not hidden in Jesus first, we have a responsibility to help teach them and help them understand that. And then we may not be able to judge their relationship with the creator of the universe, with Jesus, but we know that we can say that your identity should be hidden in Jesus. He's the overarching master Lord of your life. So you shouldn't be defining your life by the fact that, if that's the case, and my wife says this a lot, then why don't we, have banners up? Because some of the churches, I guess, the Chosen is doing this on set, where they've got pride flags up. Well, why don't we have flags in church that say, yay for robbery, yay for murder, yay for pedophilia?
Why do we have to have flags up? I don't want to know. I don't want to celebrate any of those things. I want to give the Holy Spirit an opportunity to work on all those things, but I don't want to celebrate any of that stuff. So I guess I'm confused on how to lovingly help someone through that. We're called to love each other as ourselves. We're called to walk with people through stuff, but we're also called to admit our own failings so that somebody can walk with us through that. And I don't do that. So how do you do all this as a church and do it well and do it right and do it so it honors God? I don't think churches today are doing it.
I think, to me, I think one of the ways the Lord's teaching me has nothing to do with church whatsoever. It's just kind of some things going on in life. Is where we run into problems is kind of twofold. One, what you're saying, Diane, I think is so true. We can't kind of back ourselves into a corner and say, well, I'm a sinner. I don't have standing to be able to say something to somebody else. But we can't go the other way and say, well, your sin is so horrible, I got to call you out. I mean, I think Paul gives us a real good blend of that. I mean, you look at Romans 7, where he pretty much says, I know that I'm doing the wrong things, thinking the wrong things, and I'm there. But that doesn't keep him from 1 Corinthians 5 telling people, hey, if that guy's going to continue to sin, put him out. And so there's a balance there, I think, that's very real, that, yeah, I stink. I know I stink. But my stinkiness doesn't keep me from calling out other people's stinkiness when it's a threat to the cause of Christ. We've got to be able to live that. But I think where I have often made the mistake and continue to regularly is not having a willingness to speak about the facts and not make it personal and not take it places where it shouldn't go. And that's where judgmentalism, I think, comes into play so often, is like, I don't know your heart. I hardly know mine. But yet I will make pronouncements about things instead of just speaking the truth, which says that is sin. I'd like to help you get over it, but what I want to say is that is sin, and you're a terrible person. And that's where we go off the rails. And it's like just speak the truth in love, and let the rest of that stuff float away. Because the other issue is in our world today is, I want to tell you what's wrong with you and why I'm affected by that. It's not about me.
Right.
But I want to get all caught up in that. It's like, it's not about me. I'm just a messenger. And I don't know why we've got to, I'm going to say me. I've got to let my baggage come into play. My feelings about it really are inconsequential. Is what God feels about it. Right. So, yeah, if you offend me, that's another thing. But usually I'm offended for the wrong reasons. It's pride or something else. I don't know. I just think we get the emotions into it too much. You started this whole session, Diane, talking about how we're just so hard to get along with these days. And I think that's the big issue, is that we're all so stinking easily offended in our culture today. So if I start in the point that I'm offended, and I just ran into this buzzsaw a couple of weeks ago with a homeowner in my association here, and they just hacked me off. And I kind of told them so, which they responded in a really even more super negative way. But a friend of mine said something here a couple of years, it's been longer than that, but he said something that really I replay in my head over and over again. He said, I've purposed it in my heart not to be offended. And I told him, I hope I'm like you when I grow up, because I ain't there.
Yeah, the Jesus Revolution movie, when some of the older churches couldn't handle what was happening in their church. They didn't like the revitalization. They didn't like the new music. They did, it wasn't the same old traditional that they were used to. They got up and walked out. And, I think we get too complacent sometimes in our church body that they were exuding judgment. You could see it in their faces. And I think we do that. I've seen that in churches. I saw it in a church we visited one Christmas. It was Christmas Eve. I went for a service because my husband and daughter had attended there a couple times. And it was like nobody wanted to meet our eyes. Like they were just thinking, oh, they're just here for the holiday, like we do. They're going to come Easter, Christmas.
Mother's Day.
It's we do it. You parked in my place. You sat in my pew. Those are little things. We can't even be trusted with the little things, and we can't expect someone to change overnight. It's a process. But, how we mentor and walk alongside someone, I think we get a little messed up. And it takes time, and it takes, sacrifice of time that you might spend on something else. And I don't know about you, but I've discovered in the last few weeks, maybe I'm not as good in that direction as I thought I was.
So that's why our lessons have these kind of exchanges, folks, because when they're more personal for us, we're going to be able to apply and assess them better, because it's not just something coming out of a Sunday school weekly that's telling you you're supposed to do this. These are examples. I mean, Sherry's situation is going to linger with me for quite some time. And that's the kind of big boy pants situation you need to consider putting on, because anything other than that, you need to shutting up. Because if the Lord is able to supernaturally protect you and calm and give you peace, then he's got the little stuff. And we're doing a good job, I think, transitioning, because we'll have fun. And this is kind of when we have folks who are maybe not a part of our group or folks that are watching this. It's fun for them to think about the things that cause them fear. Amusement park rides, spiders, bridges, heights, that sort of stuff. What we're really kind of gonna try to focus on is the interpersonal reactions, the interpersonal relationships, the kind of doing what it is that you have just brought up, which is how to train yourself not to be offended, how to train yourself to deal with just the facts, ma'am, because that mentality then will help you to not escalate because of your emotional quotient. It'll help you to deliver a message and to try to do it objectively as opposed to subjectively. And then you're going to feel good in some regard because you've delivered the message. And then if there's an arbiter, depending on how, perhaps Holy Spirit oriented this interaction is, arbiter is the Holy Spirit. So that means, folks, that's how we can keep folks in our midst who are LGBT, LG, whatever the letters are, that are thieves, that are drug users, right? Because the key is, this is that phrase we like to use in churches. This is how we speak into their lives, and how we excommunicate them, folks, is not how churches practice this. How we excommunicate them is, we can no longer, if they continue to say, I'm a gay Christian, I'm a black Christian, I'm a female Christian. And I don't mean female in the I'm a lady. I mean I'm women, hear me roar. That sort of sensibility. That the key is, we need to help them understand that Jesus first. And what that also means is that means that we have to minister to them, and this is a reason that they're going to leave. We have to minister to them like they're unbelievers. That's how we excommunicate them. So we don't kick them out of the church. We don't publicly humiliate them in that sort of sense. But what we do is, we can't take for granted that they have a relationship with the creator of the universe, that they know who Jesus is. And churches struggle with that. But folks, and it's not just us kind of struggling with that. The folks who are kind of the recipients struggle with that. We years ago, and I hope it's too long for you to remember, we had suggested that for folks that were doing eager learning, that they would be a part of a 201 or 301 kind of learning program in our group. And the folks who didn't seem either interested, didn't want to be able to attend, came on, every other 6-month interval, those folks would be in a simpler learning strata. And we had folks get very, very, very upset about that, because we weren't seeing necessarily the fruit that suggested that there was a maturity. And so we were saying, we need to minister to you in a certain way, because that's what our church is, that's what we're supposed to do. Is minister, to provide service. And that's what we were doing. And folks got very, very offended that they landed perhaps in the strata that was offered to them. And folks, that's what's going to happen when we address folks who are gay Christians, when they're bi Christians, when they're black Christians, when they're whatever kind of Christian, as opposed to just being Jesus believers. So let me pause there. Yes, sir.
All right, I'm opening myself up for mocking. Christine and I have one of those smart beds that is attached to an app that tells you how well you sleep. And it measures your heart rate and your breathing rate, but it also measures HRV, which is your heart rate variability, and apparently that's a big deal. Christine's is always really stellar. Mine is almost like through the floor, which apparently is an indicator that I'm under a fair amount of stress. Or it could be that I watch scary stuff before I go to sleep at night. I don't know which that might be, but it's one or the other. But, I've been thinking about that. It's like, well, why is that so bad? because my heart rate's good. My heart rate's in the low 60s, it's good and everything. But what I've come to realize is I've been in a pretty high level of change for a long time. And I've just lived outside my comfort zone more often than not over the last 2 or 3 years, and specifically over the last 6 months. It's just there's a lot of change going on, and it's not an accident they say the best time for change is when you're in a mode of change, right? I mean,
Correct.
that's when it's easier. But I think about that, and I've kidded about this. Is that feeling you have when you're going to trip and fall a lot. I mean, right now as I'm speaking to you, I've got that in me because I'm dealing with some stuff in life, and it's just after a while you kind of get used to it. You kind of get used to the fact that you're uncomfortable. And I've heard athletes talk about this, is that helps them to play at a higher level because guys that have played professional basketball for a decade nervous when they step on the floor, but they like that. They embrace it because it helps them to play more sharply. And I think all that to say, I still have stuff to fight against, right? I mean, at this point, I should be able to run out in traffic without any problem, right? Just I'm that way kind of all the time these days, and I'm thankful to God for that because it's have. But I think the trend for us as we get older is we want that as little as is humanly possible. I want my own seat because I'm comfortable there. I want my parking space because I'm comfortable there. I want to be in that Sunday school class with other people like me because I'm comfortable there. And the enemy of church want to sing the songs the people restaurants you like. Doggone it. What you're describing, Preston, runs headlong into the current group that you're speaking to, because we're looking for more comfort, not less. We're looking for more predictability in our life, not less. And so you're swimming up a stream, bro, for all of us, quite frankly. But the remedy to that is running toward discomfort. Nate was busting on his mom, shouldn't do that. But, and not to pick on Sarah, but if you got a fear of the edge of the bridge, drive as close to the edge as you can humanly do. And whatever that is. Like if you don't like haunted houses, let go of your friend's hand. Step out, man. Yeah, you can't pick on me because you told us that story. So I'm Teflon today. But I hope that makes sense. We need to run into the burning building. Is kind of where we got to be. And it's an amazing thing. I mean, yeah, Sherry humbled all of us today because I haven't been there. So I'm all bold, but yet I haven't stood in a jewelry shop robbery. So got a ways to go on that. Anyway, I hope that makes sense.
I think, Guy, that is the beginnings of our consideration how to address sin in the camp after Jesus' death and resurrection, and that he lives now. Because sin in the camp was punishable differently before Jesus came, right? And right now, the arbiter of the whole of sinfulness and that 1 Corinthians 5 stuff is the Holy Spirit's got to illuminate that for people. But it's our job to let them know that whole baptism is that they are dead to themselves and they're now risen and alive in Jesus. And so that has got to be their overarching persona. And it's important for us to yell that without it being judgmental. And if it is judgmental, it's judgmental toward the behavior and not the person. And we have to do a better job of helping people know. And this is, that love the sinner, hate the sin is stupid. That phrase is just getting us no place. What we have to recognize is that we have to let people know the very fact that we're mentioning something to them is because we care. Because we care. And we don't do a very good job of that. That's what we don't do. We say this phrase and the phrase stinks. We have to say to folks, because I try to do this regularly, if I did not care about you, I would not tell you this. The fact that I'm telling you this is because I care. And we need to do a better job. That's that relationship stuff. When you create a certain kind of relationship, then you can say, I almost wrecked 2 relationships last week because I told one person that they were afraid of dying and there was a way not for them to be afraid of dying, and I wanted to get close to them to help them understand that. And they took a week to get back in touch with me. I thought during that time I had lost that friendship. And then another person who you all have met reached out and said, "Hey, I'm wondering how you're doing." And I said, "Hey, I'm glad to know that. I've been praying for you and asking and thinking, where are you with your relationship with Jesus now?" And the person sent me back a whole lot of pith. Well, I'm really praying about that, and I'm hoping. And I said, "Well, that's neat, but what are you going to do if you were to die today? What state would you be in, and would you spend more time worrying about where your family is, or would you need to be concerned with your relationship with your Creator?" And after that particular exchange, haven't heard from him yet. So, but that's the kind of meddling that you can do when you're close to a person, and the reason that you're asking is because you care. And the person, look, I've tried to be supportive of this person almost through the worst behavior someone can practice. So they know that I care. But at the same time, I care more about, not at the end of the day, what their family status and their investment status is. I care more about where they're going to end up in eternity. So I can talk junk and risk the possibility of a relationship at the same time, because that's more important. All right, other stuff as we wind down. You're right, Bruce. You can't top Sherry, and it's not a matter that Sherry was looking to be topped, but if you will please allow her discussion point to stay with you, the whole point of our discussion is going to linger kind of where Sherry ended, which is he's there. I know he's there. He's taking care of the big stuff. The other issue is sometimes, though, I let the little stuff be so overwhelming that gets in the way all the time. And it's stuff like that. That's why it's a terrific opportunity and a terrific time spending time with you all, especially in person, but certainly virtually. This is the kind of learning, this is the kind of ingesting for me that's going to stay with me during the course of my week, and hopefully back me off of a cliff when I'm going to punch somebody when I shouldn't. I'm going to be thinking about Bruce's bed. I'm going to be thinking about Bruce driving on a volcano better than anybody. I'm going to think about Diane learning how to swim, because all of those things are going to temper my ability to sometimes live on the edge a little bit better, to deal with the fearful a little bit better, because I have friends and I have brothers and sisters through extension of Jesus's blood that are going through similar stuff. We just don't always share it. So I know you guys are still living through it. So if you're living through it, it means we don't just die. I can at least think about maybe dying is not the option. That's not going to be the outcome. Something else might. And maybe I can put myself in position to deal with the something else. And the other crazy thing, too, is I appreciate Gene saying, well, maybe these are some of the experiences I've never had before. Okay, good. So vicariously and through this kind of exchange, jump on board. Because this is the kind of stuff, folks, that when we're going to be tutoring and counseling and mentoring and advising, this is the kind of life stuff that exists for people. When Pastor Bruce talks about the self-medication during the 20s, guys, if we've not lived all that, and thank you, Diane, some of us did that. In fact, when Ellen and I are watching these marriage shows, one of the things that she mentions all the time is that's what they seem to do. They get involved in self-medicating. They have their bachelorette parties. You know what they do? They get trashed. And that's in part to avoid this fear that they have of not only getting married without knowing somebody, but getting married. So they think getting trashed is the right way to go. And Diane said it doesn't have to be just substances. Doggone it, give me 80 donuts.